What is your main inflation progression scenario in the underlying deflationist environment?
So in the long arc of kind of human civilization, we have a deflationary outcome in the sense that as we get more and more technology, we get the prices of most things lower and lower, and so that's been kind of a multi-century trend. However, there are periods of rapid currency debasement, usually due to debt bubbles. Basically, debt gets so high that instead of letting those debt bubbles deflate and default, they increase the money supply dramatically, and that kind of undoes some of the debt problem. But of course, if you're holding bonds instead of being defaulted on nominally, you're defaulted in terms of purchasing power. Same thing for holding cash in the bank. And so I do think that we're probably going to enter, for the 2020s decade, somewhat of an inflationary counter trend to the longer term deflationary scenario that we have. And that, of course, depend partially on what policymakers decide to do, but I think that's, given how much debt's in the system, I think that's what they're going to aim for. And so, one thing to look out for is that in the next couple months, we have very easy base effects. And so when we compare, say, inflation in April compared to inflation of last year, same thing with, May compared to May of last year, we're probably going to get some pretty high numbers here. Now, that'll probably at some point cool off. But I think the main thing is that there'll be some sort of trend where there's enough fiscal spending to keep the inflation level higher than bond yields. And that could, of course, vary around the world. So, for example, Europe, because they don't have, the countries mostly don't have control of their own currency anymore. They've shared their currency in the euro. They're somewhat less prone to fiscal spending because the countries can't do it unilaterally in the same way that, say, the United States or Japan can. And so depending on what market we're talking about, there's certain political dynamics to watch. And so, for example, in the United States, the U.S. Senate has a very tight Democrats have a very tiny advantage that allows them to pass some of the things, but there's a couple of dissenters, and so there's a couple of things to watch about how much, say, the Biden can get through in terms of stimulus, and that, of course, affects overall inflation. And then we'd have to watch midterm elections in less than 2 years, about a year and a half now, to see how those play out, because that could then start affecting if you get more of a political gridlock. That could otherwise cool off the inflation for a while. Same thing with Europe. If you're monitoring European inflation, you generally want to monitor that political dynamic to see what sort of fiscal things that they're going to do. Because I think that one of the biggest drivers of inflation will be fiscal spending that is monetized by the central bank.
About the fiscal spending, what do you think about the quantity and structure of fiscal stimuli in the US and Europe?
So I think it's one of those things where because of the policy response, like because of that feedback mechanism, it's almost inevitable. The problem is, if they would have addressed this decades ago, there'd be ways out of this. But because they've driven interest rates so low, they've driven debt so high. In the United States, in particular, we've driven a tons of wealth concentration. So a very large percent of the population is living paycheck to paycheck, while a very small percent of this population has a kind of a disproportionate amount of assets. Like the top 1% own like 53% of the equity market, for example. We have this, it's more concentrated than the average European country or Japan and things like that. And so I think because we've kind of pushed society to that level, I think they're likely going to demand more and more fiscal responses. And so that's something that is when you do get that wealth concentration, historically, you do get that populism that comes in and takes some of that back. And so that's, I think, a kind of a long-term dynamic to watch, and it's a reason why I'm finding that financial history, if anything, is very useful for navigating this decade, because some of the things that are happening now are so extreme. They have to look back, multiple decades to find similar periods of time and to see kind of the various scenarios that can work out. And so there's a couple of hot spots to watch. So in the United States, again, it's that wealth concentration, that's demand for more fiscal spending. That's something to watch. In Europe, you want to watch, say, Italy, or populism in certain countries, and how that could affect, say the euro-wide politics. Whereas Japan, you have you have lower populism, you have pretty low wealth concentration, and so I'm less concerned about populism there, and I think that their fiscal response is likely to be more, gradual over time, and they have the capacity to potentially do more, and so it's kind of a country by country basis that I'm watching.